The classroom was silent, too silent. The kind of quiet that carried weight, that held the echoes of tension just beneath the surface. 12-year-old Elijah Simmons sat stiffly at his desk, his fingers curled into fists beneath the table. He could feel the eyes on him, the smirks, the barely concealed whispers. And then came the voice. "Elijah," Mrs. Caldwell said, her tone dripping with forced sweetness. "Since you seem so confident in your musical abilities, why don't you come up here and show us what you can do?" Elijah's stomach twisted into knots. He hadn't said anything, hadn't challenged anyone, but he knew what this was. A test, a joke, a way to put him in his place. The old grand piano at the front of the classroom seemed larger than ever, its polished surface gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. It was the instrument of choice for the privileged students of Brookshire Academy, a school where Elijah was one of the few kids who looked like him. He swallowed hard. He could refuse. He could stay seated, let them laugh and move on. Or he could play. Slowly he stood. The moment his fingers touched the keys, the room held its breath. And within seconds the air shifted. Everything was about to change. Elijah Simmons had learned at a young age that some places welcomed him, and some merely tolerated him. Brookshire Academy was the latter. The prestigious private school, nestled in the heart of an affluent neighborhood, was a fortress of wealth and legacy. The kind of place where last names carried weight, where generations of the same family had strolled through its marble hallways, knowing the world would always open doors for them. Elijah was different. He wasn't there because of old money or family connections. He was there on a full-ride scholarship, a golden ticket, as his mother called it, a chance to rise above, to carve out a future. But to many at Brookshire, he was an anomaly. Elijah had felt the stares from day one, the subtle glances in the lunchroom, the way some teachers hesitated before calling on him in class. It wasn't overt, not always, but it was there, the undercurrent of doubt. The silent question, does he really belong here? His safe haven was music. Tucked away in the small apartment he shared with his mother, their battered upright piano had been his escape since he was 5 years old. His mother, a former pianist herself, had taught him everything. How to read notes, how to let emotion guide his fingers, how to hear the story behind the sound. Music isn't just about playing the right notes, Eli, she had told him once. It's about making people feel something. And he did. He felt it in every key he pressed, every chord progression that swelled in his chest. When he played, the world around him faded. There were no judgmental stares, no whispered conversations about whether he was a diversity quota. There was just the music. But at Brookshire, music belonged to the elite. The school's music program was reserved for those who could afford private tutors, for students who had been groomed to perform for years. Elijah had never been invited to audition, never been encouraged to join. Mrs. Caldwell, the music teacher, made sure of that. She was an institution at Brookshire, her presence as ingrained as the school's century-old traditions. With her clipped tone and icy stares, she ruled the music department with an iron grip. She never outright dismissed Elijah, but she never acknowledged his talent either. To her, he was invisible. Until now, today, everything was about to change. And not even Mrs. Caldwell could stop it. Elijah's fingers trembled as they hovered over the piano keys. The room was suffocatingly quiet, the weight of his classmates' stares pressing down on him like an iron cage. Mrs. Caldwell stood off to the side, arms crossed, the smirk tugging at the corners of her lips barely concealed. "Well," she prompted, "let's hear it." Elijah clenched his jaw. He knew what she expected. Stumbling fingers, a clumsy attempt, enough to solidify the narrative she had already written in her mind. The black boy who didn't belong. The scholarship kid who was out of his depth, but she had no idea who he was. Taking a steadying breath, Elijah pressed down on the keys. A single note rang out, rich and full, reverberating through the classroom like the first drop of rain before a storm. Then another, then another. His hands found their rhythm, muscle memory taking over as the melody spilled effortlessly from his fingertips. Chopin, Nocturne in E-flat major. Gasps rippled through the room. Whispers. Disbelief. Elijah didn't need to look up to know their expressions had changed. He could hear it in the sudden hush, in the way even the students who had been laughing a moment ago now sat frozen, mouths slightly open. Mrs. Caldwell's smirk disappeared. Elijah kept playing. The melody wrapped around the room, commanding attention. Every rise and fall of the notes was deliberate, dripping with emotion, carrying years of discipline and passion. He wasn't just playing, he was proving something. By the time the final note faded into silence, the entire class sat motionless, stunned. Elijah slowly lifted his hands from the keys and turned to face his teacher. Mrs. Caldwell's lips pressed into a thin line. "Well," she said, clearing her throat. That was unexpected. But in her eyes, Elijah saw something else. Something she couldn't hide. Fear. Because in that moment, the power had shifted. And she knew it. Elijah's fingers hovered over piano keys, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear the quiet hum of the classroom. Mrs. Caldwell stood by the window, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. The other students sat in their polished uniforms, some smirking, others whispering. "Well, Mr. Simmons," she said, her voice clipped, "we're waiting." Elijah swallowed the lump in his throat. He knew what this was. This was an invitation. It was a test, a way for her to confirm, in front of everyone, that he didn't belong. His hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the keys, his mind racing. He could play something simple, something safe. Or he could remind himself why he was here, why he had spent countless nights practicing in his tiny apartment, why his mother had worked extra shifts just to afford a second-hand keyboard when the piano at home needed repairs. He took a deep breath and began to play. The moment the first notes filled the room, everything else melted away. The smirks, the whispers, the heavy weight of expectation. He wasn't playing for them anymore. He was playing for himself. The melody swelled, deep and resonant, the rise and fall of emotions pouring from his fingertips. He played a piece of his own creation, one he had written late at night when sleep wouldn't come, a song filled with longing, with hope, with the weight of unspoken words. The room fell silent. When he finally lifted his hands, the last note still hanging in the air, he dared to look up. Mrs. Caldwell's expression was unreadable. A flicker of something surprise crossed her face, but it was gone in an instant. "That will be all," she said abruptly, turning away. "Take your seat." Elijah sat down, his heart still racing. He had played his soul out in front of them, yet Mrs. Caldwell hadn't even acknowledged it. But then, as he glanced around, he saw something unexpected. Not everyone was smirking. A few students looked impressed. One, a girl named Claire, gave him a small nod of approval, and that was enough. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of challenges. Elijah wasn't officially part of the music program, but word had spread about what happened in class. A few students who had dismissed him before now watched him differently. Some even approached him in the hallways, asking about his music, about what he played. But Mrs. Caldwell wasn't so easily swayed. "Elijah, a moment," she said after class one day. He stopped, gripping the strap of his backpack. She eyed him carefully before speaking. "There's a recital next month. Our students will be performing. I assume you'll want to participate." Elijah felt a surge of excitement. "Yes, ma'am. I'd love to." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll need to see if you can keep up with the program standard. Private lessons are required for all students in the recital." Elijah's excitement dimmed. Private lessons? He could barely afford school supplies for months. She must have noticed the hesitation. "If you can't commit, I understand," she said, turning away. "Brookshire requires dedication." Elijah clenched his jaw. "I'll be there." The struggle began immediately. With no private tutor, Elijah had to train himself. He stayed late in the music room, practicing until his fingers ached. The janitor, Mr. Lewis, noticed and started letting him stay an extra hour after closing. "Kid, you got something special," the older man said one night, watching as Elijah ran through scales. "Don't let them tell you otherwise." Elijah nodded, but he couldn't shake the exhaustion creeping in. He was juggling schoolwork, music, and helping his mama home. Some nights, he barely got any sleep. He could feel the weight of it pressing down, the doubts creeping in. Then, one afternoon, as he rushed into the music room, he stopped short. Mrs. Caldwell was at the piano, flipping through sheet music. "I took the liberty of selecting a piece for you," she said, without looking up. Elijah frowned. He had planned to play his own composition. "I'd like to play something I wrote," he said carefully. Mrs. Caldwell finally looked at him. "This is a prestigious recital. Elijah, the audience expects classical excellence. I need to ensure your performance meets expectations." His stomach twisted. "But this is non-negotiable." She handed him the sheet music. Elijah stared at the paper, frustration burning in his chest. This wasn't just about the music. It was about control, about proving whether he could conform. That night, he sat at his keyboard at home, the sheet music in front of him. He played it flawlessly, but it felt hollow. His mother, listening from the couch, noticed. "What's wrong?" Elijah hesitated before answering. "She won't let me play my own music." His mother sighed, walking over and placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Eli, when you play, people listen. Don't let anyone take that away from you." He looked up at her, determination settling in his bones. He would play their piece. But when the time came, he would make his own, and Mrs. Caldwell wouldn't be able to ignore him anymore. The auditorium was packed. Chandeliers cast a golden glow over the audience, their hushed conversations blending into an ambient murmur. The grand piano stood at center stage, polished to a mirror sheen, reflecting the rows of expectant faces. Backstage, Elijah's hands curled into fists. His heart pounded, his breath shallow. He had practiced the assigned piece endlessly. He could play it in his sleep. Every note, every pause, perfectly executed. But it wasn't his. It wasn't the music inside him. He glanced at the program in his trembling hands. His name was listed, right below, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. "Elijah," Mrs. Caldwell's voice cut through his thoughts. She stood beside him, her usual stern expression in place. "Remember, this is about discipline and tradition. Play as rehearsed." He met her gaze, something fierce burning inside him. "Yes, ma'am." She nodded once, satisfied, then walked off to take her seat in the audience. Elijah exhaled, stepping toward the stage. The murmuring faded as he entered the spotlight. He sat down at the piano, flexing his fingers. The auditorium fell silent. Then he began to play. The first few notes rang out, delicate, precise. He followed the composition exactly as written, just as Mrs. Caldwell had demanded. He could feel her watching from the front row, arms crossed, ready to dissect his performance. But then something shifted. His fingers hesitated for the briefest second, and in that moment, Elijah made his choice. Instead of moving to the next note in the sheet music, he transitioned seamlessly into something else, something his. The familiar chords of his own composition emerged, weaving through the air with quiet intensity, a melody born from sleepless nights, from whispered dreams, from every unspoken word he had ever swallowed down. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A murmur of confusion. Mrs. Caldwell stiffened in her seat, eyes narrowing. Elijah ignored them all. His hands danced across the keys, his soul pouring into every note. It was raw, honest, unapologetic. The music swelled, filling the space like a storm breaking over the ocean. His heart raced, not with fear, but with something stronger, freedom. For the first time, he wasn't proving himself. He was being himself. The final note lingered in the air, then faded into silence. For a breathless moment, No one moved. Then applause, thunderous, roaring. People leaped to their feet. Some clapped, others cheered. Elijah exhaled, his chest rising and falling. His hands trembled, not with nerves but with exhilaration. He stood, scanning the crowd, faces blurred together. But then he found his mother. She was on her feet, hands clasped over her mouth, tears shining in her eyes. Then his gaze fell on Mrs. Caldwell. She hadn't stood, hadn't clapped, but there was something else. Shock, and beneath it, something close to respect. Elijah took one last look at the piano, the instrument that had once been his greatest challenge, now his greatest triumph, then turned to face the crowd. He had done it, and he had done it his way. The thunderous applause still rang in Elijah's ears as he stepped off the stage. His hands were still trembling, not from nerves, but from the sheer adrenaline of what he had just done. For the first time in his life, he had played not to impress, not to conform, but to express himself, truly express himself. And the audience had felt it. As soon as he reached the backstage area, his mother was there. "Elijah," she called, rushing toward him, her heels clicking against the floor. She didn't hesitate. Her arms wrapped around him in a fierce hug. "I am so proud of you, baby." Elijah let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I thought you might be mad." She pulled back just enough to look him in the eyes, her expression soft yet determined. "Mad? Elijah, you did something tonight that most people never have the courage to do. You spoke your truth. Through your music." She cupped his face in her hands. "You didn't just play tonight, baby. You became the music." His throat tightened, but before he could respond, another voice interrupted. "Elijah." He turned. Mrs. Caldwell stood a few feet away, her hands clasped in front of her. Her usual stern expression was unreadable, but there was something different about the way she looked at him. His mother stepped aside, her hand squeezing his shoulder before letting go. For a long moment, Mrs. Caldwell said nothing. Then finally she spoke. "You disobeyed me." Elijah's pulse jumped. He straightened his back, bracing for whatever came next. But then she exhaled a slow, measured breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. And yet, I've never seen an audience react like that before. Elijah's eyes widened slightly. She studied him for a moment before nodding, as if coming to a decision. "You took a risk, and you played with something most musicians spend their whole lives trying to find." "What's that?" he asked cautiously. "Honesty." Elijah blinked. He hadn't expected that. Mrs. Caldwell continued. "You may not have played the piece I assigned, but what you played was remarkable." A small pause, and undeniable. For the first time, there was no condescension in her tone, no rigid disapproval, only recognition. Elijah swallowed. "So, what does that mean?" "It means," she said, tilting her head slightly, "you have something special, and if you're willing to work at it, truly work at it, I can help you refine it." His breath caught. This was the same woman who had dismissed him, underestimated him, tried to force him into a mold that was never meant for him. And now she was offering to help him, not to control him, not to change him, but to make him better. For the first time, Mrs. Caldwell saw him, not as a student to be corrected, but as a musician, as an artist. A slow smile spread across Elijah's face. "I like that." She nodded once. "Good." Then, in a rare, almost imperceptible gesture, she extended her hand. Elijah hesitated for only a second before shaking it. It wasn't a victory over her. It wasn't about proving her wrong. It was something greater. A bridge. A new beginning. 1 year later, the grand hall was packed once again, but this time, Elijah stood on the stage as more than just a student. His fingers hovered over the keys, the warm glow of the stage lights washing over him. The crowd was silent in anticipation. He took a deep breath. Then he began to play. Not Chopin, not Beethoven, not anyone else, his own composition. The music flowed from him effortlessly, each note a piece of his journey. Every struggle, every doubt, every triumph woven into the melody. And as he played, he knew this wasn't the end of his story. It was only the beginning. Years later, Elijah sat in the same grand concert hall, but this time, not as a student. He stood backstage, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit, listening to the soft murmur of the audience settling in. The program bore his name in elegant lettering, Elijah Carter. Solo piano performance and original compositions. He had performed all over the world. His music had reached places he had never imagined as a boy sitting in that rigid classroom, feeling like he had to prove himself. But now he understood. He had never needed to prove his worth. He only needed to share his truth. As he stepped onto the stage, his eyes scanned the audience. In the front row, his mother beamed with pride. Beside her sat an older woman, her silver hair neatly pinned back, watching him with sharp yet approving eyes. Mrs. Caldwell. Elijah smiled to himself before sitting at the piano. He placed his fingers on the keys and took a deep breath. Then, with confidence, with joy, and with a lifetime of stories to tell through music, he played. And in every note, there was a message. Talent transcends prejudice. Music speaks louder than doubt. And the truth, when given the chance, will always be heard.